And I think one thing with climate, we talk about our climate impact as an isolated issue, but we need to talk about it as an aspect of fossil fuel use. So it's a side effect of fossil fuel use. So I do believe there is the side effect. We have to look at it in the context of the benefits. And so part of my argument is going to be that the benefits of fossil fuels far, far outweigh any negative side effects.
Yeah, so climate change is definitely occurring. And in fact, I think there's very little argument over that at this point. Even the most ardent opponents acknowledge the climate's changing. I mean, all you have to do is look out your window, caused by human activities, mainly the emission of carbon dioxide. And, the evidence is so strong that if you were on a jury, you would have no qualms about convicting carbon dioxide of changing the climate.
Welcome to episode 126 of the Mikhaila Peterson podcast. Opposing Views has the format where I speak with one person with one view of a contentious subject and another person with the opposite view. I find it insanely interesting. In this episode, we covered climate change with Andrew Dessler and Alex Epstein. The controversy around climate change spans more than a century, the crucial point being whether climate change is happening. And if so, how much humans contributed to that, especially after the Industrial Revolution. My first guest, Andrew Dessler, is a professor of atmospheric sciences at Texas A&M and a climate scientist who studies the science and politics of climate change. Dessler served as a senior policy analyst for the Clinton administration and is the author of two books, Introduction to Modern Climate Change and The Science and Politics of Global Climate Change, A Guide to the Debate. Then on the second half, I had Alex Epstein on. Alex is a philosopher, author, energy theorist, and industrial policy pundit. He founded the Center for Industrial Progress and wrote The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, a New York Times bestseller, arguing that, contrary to popular belief, humanity needs fossil fuels to flourish. If you enjoy this episode, please consider subscribing. And let me know what you think about climate change or which arguments you found the most compelling in the comments below. This episode is brought to you by Rabbit Air. I had serious trouble getting quality deep sleep, especially when I was stressed out. I had no idea why, other than the stress. Couldn't figure it out. Turns out I was having allergies to the dust in my room because I'm allergic to everything. It was a new condo, so I was surprised. I got an air purifier and it increased my deep sleep by 30% right away. I used my Oura Ring to test that. Rabbit Air has a super clean, very attractive air purifier that I recommend to everyone now. It's quiet, it's easy to clean, and it looks great in rooms. It's changed the way I sleep. Their BioGS 2.0 model, I'll show you guys. Look at that, baby. Won the world's most prestigious Red Dot Design Award thanks to its stylish design and the advanced filtration technology that targets airborne allergens, particles, and odors effectively. Cute, huh? Even if you have no issue sleeping, we still breathe in nearly 2,000 gallons of air a day, and decades of research have shown that air pollutants raise both the number of cases and severity of lung and heart disease, among other health problems. Stuffy nose, for example. On top of that, according to the EPA, Americans spend around 90% of their time indoors, which is horrifying, where the air is 2 to 5 times more polluted than outside. Thankfully, Rabbit Air's purifiers have a 6-stage filtration system that traps even micron-sized pollutants, which can range from mildly annoying to seriously harmful, depending on where you live and the air quality around you. And if you're not convinced, Rabbit Air offers a 5-year warranty, free shipping and returns, and a 90-day money-back guarantee on all their products. Do yourself a favor, visit rabbitair.com today to see their models or call them 24/7 to speak to a Rabbit Air consultant. That's Rabbit, like the bunny, RABBITAIR, rabbitair.com, for some of the best air purifiers you'll find anywhere and ones that look good. Alex Epstein, welcome to my podcast.
Hey, great to be here.
Before we get started, can you give a brief background about who you are and what it is you do?
Sure. I think of myself as two things, a philosopher and energy expert. Those two don't always go together, but so philosopher is somebody who helps people think more clearly about important issues in life. And then I study energy, which is the food that our machines use to make our lives better. And I think maybe the biggest difference between me and other people is I have a very explicitly pro-human philosophy for thinking about energy and also the way it impacts the rest of nature. And my view, this might be controversial, so I think that most people actually have an anti-human way of thinking about energy and our environment. And I believe the main differences on this issue are not scientific, they're philosophical.
Interesting. Okay. That's a fun way of looking at it. Well, we're going to be talking about climate change, fossil fuels, renewable energy. I interviewed somebody who was kind of on the other side of the debate, I guess, which would be more, fossil fuels are not what we should be using anymore. I guess that would be summed up as his argument. But I'm going to ask you guys similar questions so people can see the differences in answers. So first of all, what are your views on, just an overview on climate change and how much of that is a problem because of humans?
Yeah. So I think the key way of thinking, so just to look at it from a philosophical perspective, I think there are a few ways of looking at it that help clarify things and also help explain why a lot of the catastrophe thinking doesn't make much sense. So the first thing is we just have to be precise about what we mean. So I prefer to talk about like man-made climate impact versus climate change, because climate change is very ambiguous, like what kind of change, how big, and then also who is causing it. So I do believe in man-made climate impact. So that's one thing, I'll say that. And then, but when you're looking at man-made climate impact, you have to look at it in its full context. And in particular, you need to look at it as a side effect of fossil fuel use. So, we're talking a lot these days about antibiotics, about vaccines, particularly vaccines. And whatever anyone thinks of a particular vaccine, I think everyone would agree you have to look carefully at both the benefits of a vaccine and the side effects of a vaccine, and you have to weigh them. And I think one thing with climate, we talk about our climate impact as an isolated issue, but we need to talk about it as an aspect of fossil fuel use. So it's a side effect of fossil fuel use. So I do believe there is the side effect. We have to look at it in the context of the benefits. And so part of my argument is going to be that the benefits of fossil fuels far, far outweigh any negative side effects from climate. And in particular, this is true because fossil fuels, like with the vaccine or antibiotic, they have benefits and side effects that are somewhat unrelated. Like, okay, they'll cure you of a condition if it's antibiotic, but then it has a side effect. But fossil fuels are actually magical because their benefits actually cure their side effects. So let's say fossil fuels leads to an increase in drought. Well, but fossil fuels also allow you to purify water. They also allow you to irrigate water. They also allow you to move food from where you have a good harvest to where you have a bad harvest. And what we see over the past 100 years, and I believe we have impacted water somewhat in the world. It's hard to say positive or negative, I think, but whatever has happened, drought-related deaths have gone down by over 99%. Over the last century. People think of them as getting worse, but they're actually getting better. Why is that? In large part because the benefit of fossil fuels, one key benefit is drought mastery. So we've increasingly become masters of drought. And so it's just one way in which if you don't look at the benefits of fossil fuels along with the climate side effects, you cannot think about it rationally, both because there are benefits of fossil fuels to every area of life, like hospitals and food and so on, but there are many climate mastery benefits in particular. So that's the second thing. So we need to look at it precisely. We need to look at it in the context of the benefits, including the climate mastery benefits. And then the third thing is when we're looking at man-made climate impact, we cannot have the bias that it's intrinsically wrong. Usually when people talk about climate change, there's this assumption that it's immoral and it must be bad. And my view is you need to actually look at it. And if you're talking about something like rising CO2 levels leading to a warming impact on the global climate system, you can be pretty sure that there's going to be at least a lot of positive from that. It could easily be outweighed by the negative, but there's a lot of positive in the world getting warmer, particularly if you study the models and the history. It tends to get warmer in some of the coldest places in the world, particularly at northern latitudes. That's why there's so much focus on the Arctic melting. But that's from a human perspective, probably a good thing, because what it means is places like Siberia get warmer than places like Mexico. And if you look at the history of the planet, I think this holds true. When the really warm periods, like the world has been 25 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than it is today, but it's not that the equator got super warm, it's that the poles get warmer. The other thing about CO2 that's related to climate related to life is that it has a fertilizing effect. And so the reason I'm bringing up both the benefits of warming and fertilizing is not to say that they outweigh the negatives on their own. but that we have an anti-human impact bias. We tend to think of rising CO2 because we created it. Oh, it must be bad. And so I think these three failures to think about the issue precisely, to look at the benefits and to look at the impacts from a pro-human unbiased perspective, I think that's actually what causes people to think that climate change is the end of the world. I think if you look at it in the full context from a human perspective, I think it's fairly obvious that we should be using far more fossil fuels.
Okay, that was good. Where do I want to start with that? Okay, what about the argument that we should be transitioning from fossil fuels to renewable sources of energy? How do you feel about that?
Yeah, so I think that argument itself betrays a couple of things. So one is the obsession with renewable, I think should be a red flag to anyone. It's a question of like, why are we obsessed with renewable? Because in practice, renewable means primarily solar and wind. If you look at renewable mandates, most of them exclude large scale hydro, and they certainly exclude nuclear. And what large scale hydro and nuclear have in common is they are by far the two most practical, proven non-carbon alternatives to fossil fuels. Now, they can't do everything fossil fuels can do, and solar and wind certainly can't. So they don't produce, they're not really good at really high temperatures for industry, and they're certainly not good for heavy duty transportation, although nuclear could be in the future. But they're pretty good at generating a lot of electricity, particularly nuclear, because you can use it anywhere in the world. And yet the modern anti-fossil fuel movement that says rising CO2 levels are an existential threat, they deliberately exclude nuclear and hydro. So why is that? Why do they insist on renewable? And my view is that's a philosophical thing. Renewable is viewed as natural, like we're not impacting nature as much. And so that's why they favor it. And then in practice, what you see, though, is actually there's a lot of opposition to solar and wind in practice. Like the amount of mining we're doing, the amount of building of these things, and the amount of transmission line building is not at all keeping pace with what people say is necessary. But it's getting opposed by what? By green activists saying, hey, this has too much impact. So what you can see with the opposition, not just to fossil fuels, but nuclear, hydro, and renewables, is that there's this idea that human impact is bad and we have to stop it. And that's a philosophical view. And that's the view that our ultimate goal or our main goal should be to eliminate human impact on nature. And my goal is, or I think our goal should be to advance human flourishing. And that's why I think so that's the first flag, like to advocate renewable is suspicious. And then to advocate renewable and to not be concerned by the fact that renewable is being stopped all over the world, that's another flag. Because if you notice, most people don't know that the renewable development is being stopped by the green movement all around the world. It's really hard to build this stuff. And yet, if you look at the news media and the advocates of this stuff and the politicians, they almost never talk about the fact that the green movement is stopping them, but they're so gung-ho about still restricting fossil fuels, even though their alleged replacement isn't even allowed to work. And the other thing is, if you look at this stuff in practice, when we're now living through this right now in the world, and particularly in Europe, what's happened is we've made policies for the past 20 years saying, hey, we can restrict fossil fuels and solar, and we're going to mandate and subsidize a lot of solar and wind, and they'll make up the difference. And what's happening right now? Fossil fuel prices are skyrocketing. People are scrambling for natural gas and coal. What does that mean? That means the promise that these could be easily replaced by the solar and wind was a false promise. What's happening is when China needs energy, they're not trying to build more windmills. They're trying to get coal and natural gas from around the world. So that's another indication. And the basic reason for why this stuff doesn't work at all is that it's fundamentally an unreliable input. So the sun and the wind are unreliable. You can call them intermittent, but basically you need a controllable source of energy to get electricity. And so when you insist on having solar and wind, those can go down to near zero at any point. So it doesn't replace the reliable power plants. It just adds to the cost of reliable power plants. And then what happens, and what's happened in Texas and California, where I live, is that the costs go way up. And so what they try to do is they try to cut down on reliable power plants. Like here, we've shut down a big nuclear plant, natural gas plants. And you play this game of reliability chicken where you hope that there's enough solar and wind, and you hope that it doesn't get too hot or too cold. But then last summer, it gets too hot in California, the wind dies down. We have blackouts. In Texas, it gets too cold. They have mass blackouts. So these technologies in reality are total failures. And anyone advocating them needs to acknowledge that. And so the fact that they advocate these total failures, they don't acknowledge it. They don't care about the fact that they're being restricted. They oppose nuclear, they oppose hydro, they oppose fossil fuels. It really is pretty straightforward that it's all about the morality of eliminating human impact And it's not at all about actually being concerned about energy. The final fact is most of the world doesn't have much energy. So 1.5 billion people only use 1/3 or more of the electricity that we use in the US. Over 3 billion people use less electricity per person than the average American refrigerator. And then 3 billion people are between us, 1/3 of us, and a refrigerator. So the world needs far more energy. So the fact that we're not talking about radically expanding the availability of energy once again shows that we have an anti-energy culture that's all about eliminating human impact and is not really focused on advancing human flourishing.
Okay, that was a lot of information. I'm going to address a couple of. That was great. No. I'm going to address a couple of things you said. So I've heard that the mass blackouts in Texas were caused by water freezing in the natural gas pipes. Is that true? Because then that would be a natural gas problem, not a turbine problem.
Yeah. So I think when I'm trying to explain stuff, I try to, when possible, rely on facts that everyone has access to. And so this, I think we can also rely on facts that everyone has access to see what is the problem. So I think you're from Canada, right? Or originally from Canada? So you take Alberta, Canada, is a place with a lot of parallels to Texas, so, except it's much, much colder, right? But it's a place where it has a fairly, because people say, oh, Texas has an isolated grid, and that's the problem. Well, Alberta has a fairly isolated grid. I did a post, if people go to energytalkingpoints.com and they just search the word Alberta, you can see the data here. But basically, if you look at that exact period of time, Alberta was colder throughout than Texas was. And yet they had no problems with blackouts. Now, is it because they avoided the plague of natural gas? No, they were using about half natural gas and about half coal. Why didn't they have a problem? Well, because natural gas and coal are totally capable of dealing with winter temperatures if they have proper resiliency built in. So we know that the failure of natural gas in Texas was not something that's inherent in natural gas. It was inherent in the way natural gas was used. So there were definitely failures with natural gas, but the point is they're not inherent in natural gas. So what happened is Texas has spent huge amounts of money subsidizing wind and trying to use as much wind as possible to meet targets. And that money comes at the expense of both reliable power plants, but also the resiliency measures such as weatherizing. So there were some definite failures with natural gas, but that's because natural gas was defunded in order to fund this unreliable solar and wind. If you look again at energytalkingpoints.com, I think if you search Alberta, you'll see this. What you see is what happened in Texas is before the freeze, they were using large amounts of wind because they always use as much as they can. And then even before the turbines froze, what happened is the wind died down because wind dies down when it's cold most of the time and when it's really hot. That's one reason why it's a very bad source of energy in practice and very expensive because you always need, it doesn't appear when you need it the most. So what happened with wind was a problem inherent with wind, whereas what happened with gas was not a problem inherent in gas. It's a problem inherent with defunding gas to pay for wind. So any honest assessment of this by anyone who knows should have been, okay, let's make the reliable stuff more resilient, not let's keep using the wind that was totally unavailable.
Okay. And did the wind I don't want to get stuck on this, but I'm going to poke around anyway. Did the wind turbines freeze because of lack of wind or because they weren't built to freeze? Because the wind turbines in Alberta don't freeze.
Right. So you can weatherize. This is an important point. And there were too many people who seized on the idea of wind turbines freezing. So again, they stopped producing power before they started freezing because just the wind wasn't blowing. But yeah, they freeze because you have to weatherize them, and then that costs money. So when you're weatherizing things, you just have to look at is this worth it or not? And I think it's clearly worth it when you have something that you can actually control that's available. When you have something that you can't control that's not available, then you spend a fortune weatherizing that. Well, then it's not going to work no matter what. If it's really cold, it's not going to work even if it's not frozen.
Okay, got it. Next question. Is natural gas subsidized by the government? Because the last guy I had on, he said that wind turbines and renewable energy was actually cheap. Natural gas was expensive, but it was subsidized by the government. That's probably a poor explanation of what he said, but that's
but it's so I won't rely on what you're saying about him. But this is a kind of common argument So I keep making reference to this site in case people want to see data, but energytalkingpoints.com, you can just search any term, including subsidies. So you'll see the US government, including the Biden administration, every energy information administration basically has the same data. If you mean by subsidies, like payments to like cash payments taken from us and given to companies, the subsidies of solar and wind, are between like 20 and 200 times what the others get. So what is happening there? Why are they claiming subsidies? They use a bunch of different things to mean subsidies. And the most common one these days is they'll say, oh, well, the negative climate impacts are subsidies. And so if we really paid the full cost of the negative impacts on climate, then that would be it. So we could talk about that, but it's not really a subsidy. They're just saying, oh, it's this excess cost. And I guess my quick view on that as well, that's a really hard claim to make, because if you look at the main thing we should be concerned about with climate, which is people dying, climate-related disaster deaths are down 98% over the past 100 years. And so we're actually safer from climate than ever. The other thing is when you start looking at these kinds of externality things, not only do people have no real ability to quantify any real negatives from fossil fuels and climate, but the positives from fossil fuels are just so incredible. So you just take something like the fact that we could use coal and gas in the 1970s made possible, the computer revolution and the internet in the 1980s. And so every life saved by the internet was made possible by the fossil fuel industry. So should we pay them a big subsidy because they had all of these what's called unpriced positive externalities? So I don't want to get too much into that technical stuff, but what it shows is there's a bias always looking for negatives from fossil fuels and not looking for positives. And then the final thing about the subsidies, and this is where it's criminal that people don't admit it. The real thing that's worse than a subsidy is that almost every grid in the US has a completely ridiculous payment policy that's rigged toward wind and solar, which is you get paid the same for reliable electricity as unreliable electricity. So that's just complete. You would never do that in work, right? You never say, oh, I've got to, I'll pay the podcast producer who comes in 1/3 of the time and I don't know when, and the podcast producer comes exactly when I need him. Like if they're charging the same rate, that's not the same rate. Or if somebody says like, here's a car and it'll work 1/3 of the time, that's not the same as a car that works when you need it. But the way our grids work for various bad historical reasons is that they pay the same for a unit of wind whenever it feels like coming in or doesn't, as they do for a unit of nuclear. And this is, by the way, a big reason why nuclear is declining, even though it's very practical, is we have these unfair payment policies that pay the same for wind. And then what happens is wind, it's a kind of long technical thing, but nuclear, if you looked at the cost over time, makes so much more sense than unreliable wind and solar. But because of the irrational payment policies, we're shutting down nuclear plants at record rates. And in a world where people claim to care about CO2. So again, it shows the goal is not at all about lowering emissions for some good human purpose. It's really just about eliminating all our impact and not caring about lack of energy.
Okay. Back to, say, climate change and the potential disasters that are ensuing because of rising CO2 levels. So what is it with the argument that there are going to be more hurricanes and that water level is going to rise and that's going to wipe out a bunch of the population? What are your thoughts on that?
So I think a good principle for thinking is we should only trust predictions about the future from people who acknowledge the reality of the present. I think it's really important, because almost everyone is either completely ignorant, or if you're talking about specialists who talk about this stuff, they are in denial about the fact that we are far safer from climate than ever. So if you look at storm-related deaths, flood-related deaths, which is related to sea level rises, you have to acknowledge that all of those are at record lows, and that a fossil-fueled world is a big reason why. Fossil fuels allow us to use machines to improve our lives. All the different kinds of climate protection either involve like machines themselves, like irrigation machines, or the using of machines to build up this amazing infrastructure. So the fact that nobody talks about how we're safer than ever from climate and fossil fuels are responsible means, in my view, they should not be trusted to talk about the future. And in particular, because if you deny fossil-fueled climate mastery, you can't think intelligently about the future. And a good person on this issue, you may know him as Bjorn Lomborg, who wrote a book called False Alarm. And he does a really good job of showing how many of these things that get publicized ignore what he calls adaptation. I would call it mastery. So our ability to deal with things. So they'll act like, oh, the sea level is going to rise and we're going to do nothing about it. people are just going to let it rise and they're going to drown and stuff. And so one aspect you could say is, yeah, a lot of these sea level rise projections, there's no reason to believe them as extreme as they are. But the main thing is whatever happens within the realm of possibility, human beings, if free, will be very, very adaptive. And once you factor that in, it's almost impossible to think of something that would be a problem. I've thought about this a lot because I wrote this book, Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, and then I recently have finished up its sequel called Fossil Future, and I really have been thinking about what would worry me if it happened. And I could only think of three things that would actually worry me. So one was if there was a totally uncontrollable rise in temperatures that just somehow accelerated, and that turns out to be physically impossible for reasons we can discuss. Another one with storms is not, they're talking about storms that are 5% more powerful. That worries me not one bit. It's if they were 3 or 4 times more powerful, where they could just totally demolish cities. But there's no, even the extreme people aren't predicting that. And then the other thing would be super rapid sea level rises, multiple feet per decade. But even if you look at pretty extreme UN projections, you're talking about 3 feet in 100 years. So it's just, I do believe we impact climate. So I want to make the case that you can believe totally that we impact climate, that that's a side effect of fossil fuel use, but you can believe that it's a totally masterable and worth it side effect of fossil fuels. So this idea of, you're a climate change believer or denier, that's a false alternative. That's like saying you're an antibiotic side effect believer or antibiotic side effect denier. No, you can believe that the positives outweigh the negatives. And again, I think it's actually, I know this sounds weird, but I think it's actually very obvious in the case of fossil fuels once you look at it from a pro-human philosophical framework. I don't even think it's a close call that we should actually be super terrified of climate. I think there's no basis for that, actually.
What are your views on, I feel like most of the climate change people who are advocating to put carbon taxes in or something like that, I feel like most of that's coming from either Europe or North America. What's the place in the world that actually contributes the most to CO2?
It depends how you do it because, in the aggregate, it would be China, right? I mean, they're doing the most. And it's important, though, that they have still lower per capita than we do in China. So they're not at the level of using less than a refrigerator per person, but they're somewhere I think still less than a third on average in the US. They're getting to that territory. So one thing they'll say, which is legitimate, is, hey, we're still using way less per person than you are. And that's a legitimate argument. The other legitimate argument is we are using their coal. So there's this idea, China uses coal, bad China. But what is China doing? They're largely producing stuff for us. So when we buy something from China, we are using the coal. Most of the energy we use is not energy we consume directly with the machines in our house. It's mostly energy used to produce the products and services, and that energy that we use, and that energy exists around the world. So it is the most notable thing about China, I think, is they are the most obvious refutation of the idea that the world is moving away from fossil fuels, which I think until the last month, a lot of people believed, even though the data didn't show it. I think now people are seeing, the sun and the wind aren't working too well in Europe, and it's not going to work much better in the winter. So people are scrambling for fossil fuels, and you're hearing stories about fossil fuels revenge and fossil fuels are making a comeback. But there was really this view that they were really on the way out, and that was never true. But China is kind of the most obvious example, because if you look at the amount of electricity that a place like Texas uses, China has 3 times that amount just in the pipeline for the amount of coal they're going to add. So never mind the coal they're using, which is many multiples, they're adding 3 times Texas's worth of electricity in terms of coal going forward. So that just really, I have this book, it's called Fossil Future, and that has 2 meanings. One is that we should have a fossil future. That's the right thing. That's my main focus. But the other thing is we are going to have a fossil future, whatever people say. The real risk, you mentioned Europe and North America, is that we unilaterally hurt ourselves, and that is going to be disastrous. So it's very possible the US, I think it's almost inevitable Europe makes a bunch of suicidal decisions, because that's kind of what they do throughout history. They follow their own ideas, and we usually trail them. So I think it's, someone in the world is going to totally wreck their economy and their citizens by pursuing this. And obviously China's not going to do it. Obviously Russia's not going to do it. And obviously India's not going to do it. I don't mean to equate India with China and Russia, because India is far more moral place in terms of its government. But those 3 places just show, we are headed toward a fossil future. And if you care about CO2, the only thing you can really do is advocate liberating lower cost alternatives, particularly nuclear. And so I'm a very avid advocate of decriminalizing nuclear. And because I think that's the only thing that really has the potential to outcompete fossil fuels. And even if it doesn't outcompete it in the near term, we still need a lot more energy in the world. But notice that the anti-fossil fuel movement is basically the same as the anti-nuclear movement. And again, it's because it's not about better, cleaner energy. It's just about eliminating all of our impact and really being opposed to all forms of energy and not caring about the fact that most of the world lacks energy and not caring what happens if they cut off our fossil fuel supply.
Okay, that was going to be one of my questions, is what should people do? But you're saying we're contributing. One of the side effects is CO2, increased CO2 emissions, and nuclear has less of that than fossil fuels.
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, if you have the perspective of, so people look at the world and they think, oh, the biggest problem in the world is that we're impacting climate. And I would say, no, the biggest problem in the world in this domain is that the world is totally underpowered. The world needs so much more energy than it currently has. And so that if that's your moral perspective, then it's really, okay, how do we get as much energy produced for as many people as possible? And that means liberating everything. So liberating fossil fuel use. I mean, you have laws that protect you against like genuine abuses, against real pollution, that like you want certain levels, and that'll depend on the country and how wealthy it is. But you want to liberate as many things as you can. You want to liberate nuclear. I don't find solar and wind to be all that promising, even in 20 years, but there could be ways in which they're promising. You want to liberate those, but they should have to compete fairly. They shouldn't be paid the same for unreliable electricity as reliable electricity. There's some promise longer term in what's called geothermal. That's still very small. Hydro you should use where you can, although there are issues with displacing people. So it's a little bit tricky there. But in general, the world is underpowered politically. We need to liberate energy a lot more. And then in terms of individually, I think so it's supporting those policies and also just figuring out how to advocate them. And my main idea of how to advocate them is share resources that do two things. And the number one thing is resources that reframe the conversation. I've been arguing over and over. I think it's really about a different philosophy thinking about this. So share resources that think about this issue in a more pro-human way. I think that some of the people I've mentioned, like Bjorn Lomborg, also, I don't know if you know Schellenberger. I think he was on your dad's podcast, maybe, Michael Schellenberger. Like, I think they're a growing group of what I would call energy humanists. And I think what we have in common, we have a lot of small disagreements among us, but we have in common is we're all looking at energy and climate in a big picture pro-human way. We're not just saying, oh, it's bad for us to impact climate, so let's stop. We say, how big is that impact? How positive and negative, and how does it compare to the benefit? So I'd say look for resources that frame the issue in pro-human terms and that are very accurate on the facts. And so my own contribution to this that's free is just that website, energytalkingpoints.com. And the goal there is to give anyone the resources to learn about any issue they want with really good references. And then if you agree with it, then you can spread that message in I think, very effective ways.
Okay. That's interesting. I haven't heard some of these points before. So this is fun.
I never heard them. I mean, I started out, people often think like, oh, the fossil fuel industry must have recruited you. Like, I mean, I came from a liberal place. I didn't even know anyone in the fossil fuel industry when I came up with my ideas, but all of these ideas, some of which came from me, some of which came from other people, like it was a big deal to me. Like when I realized that we were safer from ever than climate, that really blew my mind because I thought for sure, like we must be more endangered, even if fossil fuels are good in other ways, like surely, more people are dying from climate. And so when I learned, oh no, it's at a record low, it really shook me in terms of, there's something really wrong with the way I've been thinking about this issue. And the main thing was I didn't think about how energy makes our environment better. I just thought, oh, energy can only make our environment worse. And then it could offset that in other ways. But no, energy actually makes our environment way better. And without energy, we don't have a livable environment, including we have a very dirty and dangerous environment.
So has anything gotten worse than in terms of climate? Like have storms gotten worse? I know that there was a record highs in Alberta this year of heat.
It depends on what you mean by worse, because there's like ultimately how climate is an interaction between, or the livability of climate is interaction between what's happening in the global climate system and then the local weather, and then us. So you take something like a storm that could have destroyed a home 200 years ago can now be a romantic setting for an evening because of our level of mastery. So I think if you look at the livability of climate, no, nothing has gone down because our mastery ability is so great. If you look at things like, oh, is there anything that's more negative kind of absent mastery, which is sort of hard to think about? It's hard to say, but if you just take like, there are certain, I mean, I would say with warming, there's pretty clearly been about it. I would say pretty clearly, at least, been about a degree Celsius of warming in the last 150 years or so. So you could look at, okay, where is that more desirable and where is that less desirable? So there are things like that. There are questions of, okay, are there places where there's more heat waves? And there are some of those. So I don't know if anyone could say anything is globally more negative. I think in certain places, yes. But I just want to say my argument is true, even if there are things like that. So even if we could be sure that storms are 10% more dangerous, it really wouldn't be a problem at all unless there was a trajectory that was, okay, it's going to be 10%, then it's going to be 25%, right? That kind of out of control. And that's this is another philosophical issue. I think people tend to view climate and more broadly nature as what I call a delicate nurturer. So this thing that's stable and sufficient and safe, unless we impact it. And then when we impact it, it punishes us. And it's very much a hell narrative. Like if we go against the God of nature, like we're going to be thrown into this hell. And global warming is really a hell kind of narrative. Like if you look at how this actually works. So I mentioned the planet has been 25 degrees Fahrenheit warmer. It's also had at least 10 times the CO2 levels as today. And those don't correlate perfectly at all. So we know we're not in unprecedented territory with this planet. We've had way higher CO2 levels, way higher temperatures, all kinds of life thrived. It tend to thrive more when there's more CO2 because it leads to more plant growth, which is the basis of everything ultimately. And so it's just really impossible that we could make the planet unlivable. What we could do hypothetically is we could have a rate of change that was negatively disruptive. So we could change from a cooler planet, relatively speaking, because we're still a really cold planet today relative to history, to a warmer planet. And because we've made a bunch of investments, then it could be inconvenient based on the sea level rises and just the temperature changes and stuff. But it's being really slow so far. Like a degree in 150 years, it's not even anywhere near the realm of it. And people talk about, these numbers, 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees. They're talking about that's scary. But that means since the 1800s. So 1.5 degrees really means 0.5 degrees. And 2 degrees means 1 degree from now. And people are acting like that's terrifying. That's just a total denial of human mastery. And that's a moral perspective. It's just saying it was wrong of us to change the temperature. And I just don't believe that. I don't believe that it's wrong for us to change the earth. I think we should do it intelligently. And so if we're doing it in a way that's overall negative, then we should change. But this view that, it's just immoral to do, and we should stop in a world where, again, 3 billion people use less electricity per person than a refrigerator. I think it's totally morally warped.
Yeah. And anybody who thinks nature is your friend hasn't seen horseflies in Canada. Have you ever seen a horsefly?
I don't know if in person.
They shouldn't exist. They're huge. They're like this big. They look like houseflies. They take chunks out of you. Anyway.
Yeah, that's a good. It's funny. Like I'm very fortunate. I have a girlfriend who's very kind of pro-human and not nature worshiping in her orientation, and she's always saying that shouldn't exist. And that's kind of a good. Now you got to be careful with certain bugs because they are important in different ways. But it's such a rare attitude to just not worship nature. And it's not even nature. It's like conservative nature. It's just nature that we happen to inherit. People are just they're just obsessed with the way the earth was when I came into it. That's somehow perfect. And then theoretically, the idea is, the perfect earth would be the earth that existed had human beings never existed. And I just think it's a totally anti-human view. We are part of nature. And I think we're the best part of nature. And I think if Martians saw us, they think, those guys build the best nests. And yeah, the dinosaurs changed the earth and we changed the earth. And we just want to do so intelligently. And I think overall, we've done so intelligently, in some ways not. And I'm open to discussing the ways in which we haven't, or which we can do better. But if people when they say we've destroyed the earth, that is a crazy perspective from a human perspective, because the earth has never been a more livable place. And you want to talk about living in nature, 8 billion people living in nature, that's 8 billion people dying in nature. The population we have, even if you want to return to the old earth, it cannot, without machines, you cannot support 8 billion people or even 3 billion people. So you need machines, and that means you need low cost, reliable energy for the machines. And in practice, that means you need a lot of fossil fuels. And I think we still need more of them.
Okay, Alex Epstein, that was awesome. If you want to direct people to anywhere or if they want to go anywhere to find you, I think you've mentioned it, but do you have social media? Where's that? What websites?
Yeah, so they can check out the website energytalkingpoints.com, and then the social media I'm by far the most active on is Twitter, and it's just my name at Alex Epstein, and I post a lot of stuff there. So yeah, between those two resources, you should be able to find anything you need. And if you go to the energytalkingpoints.com website and you like my stuff, there's just a newsletter that you can sign up for there. So that's plenty.
Okay, thank you very much for coming on.
All right, thank you.
This episode is also brought to you by Paleo Valley 100% grass-fed beef sticks. Paleo Valley is unlike anything else on the market. They're committed to making high-quality, clean products free of problematic ingredients and farming practices that harm the environment. Free of those farming practices that harm the environment. Their products come from small family-owned farms right here in the USA that use rotational grazing, if you want to look that up, and their cows are never fed grains or harmful antibiotics. If you avoid meat for environmental reasons, you're going to love Paleo Valley's grass-fed and finished beef sticks. Now, you've probably heard of some of the tricks companies use for product taglines. For instance, did you know that companies can claim their beef is grass-fed as long as it was fed grass at some point in its life? I find that hilarious. Or that meat can be marked American-made even if only packaged in America? Paleo Valley is the real deal. I personally don't eat these because of the lamb diet. I have sensitivity to spices. But I'm advertising them because there are no preservatives, no fillers, just 100% American, 100% grass-fed and finished beef from domestic regenerative farms and organic spices. Super clean ingredients if you need a snack or are trying to lose weight. I can't eat them because I don't eat spices, but seriously, stick with meat and spices. It's great. You can help your body and the environment by trying Paleo Valley's high-quality protein today. Just head over. I got a code for you guys, MP at paleovalley.com for 15% off your first order. That's paleovalley.com with code MP for 15% off your first order. Enjoy the rest of the episode. Dr. Andrew Dessler, welcome to my podcast.
Thank you.
Before we get started and I ask you a bunch of questions, can you give a brief background about who you are and what it is you do?
So I'm a professor of atmospheric sciences at Texas A&M University. And for the last 20 years or so, I've been working on climate science, so the physics of climate, as well as climate policy. And I've been getting into other things like climate impacts recently. So in particular, how climate change affects infrastructure like energy grids.
Okay. And you've written a couple of books?
Yes, I've written books on two textbooks on climate change and climate policy, as well as a book called Introduction to Modern Climate Change, which is just sort of a primer of the whole climate problem.
Okay, great. So this is an opposing views episode, so I'm going to have you on, and then I'm going to have somebody on who has an entirely different view than you, and I'm going to ask you guys similar questions. So I'll just start off, but that's the background. This should be a good episode. First off, there's some question in some areas about whether or not climate change is, one, real, and two, caused by humans. So what are your views on that? Is it real? What is it caused by?
Yeah, so climate change is definitely occurring. And in fact, I think there's very little argument over that at this point. Even the most ardent opponents acknowledge the climate's changing. I mean, all you have to do is look out your window. And as far as what causes it, there's immense consensus, 99.99% agreement in the scientific community, based on me going to meetings and talking to scientists, that it's caused by human activities, mainly the emission of carbon dioxide. And, the evidence is so strong that if you were on a jury, you would have no qualms about convicting carbon dioxide of changing the climate.
Okay. And the only way that carbon dioxide is changing the climate is from humans, or are there other ways it could be changing? Like, are there other ways that could be contributing to it that aren't human?
So carbon dioxide, since pre-industrial, 1750, before humans started burning fossil fuels, has gone up in the atmosphere about 40%. And that is entirely due to human activity. There are no natural sources that could have increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And there's multiple lines of evidence. Again, there's essentially no debate about what's driving the increase in carbon dioxide, which is driving the changes in climate. So no, there really are no competing hypotheses. Now, that's not to say in a planet of 7 billion people, you can't find someone who will claim, oh, it's volcanoes or it's unicorns or it's something, but there's no evidence for that. And again, if you go to a meeting of people who are experts on this, people who've devoted their lives to studying it, they'll say, of course it's humans. We're dumping billions of tons into the atmosphere every year, and the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere is going up by billions of tons. I mean, if it's not humans, where is all of the emissions that we're emitting going?
That seems fair. What are your thoughts on how to solve this problem?
So from a physics standpoint, solving the problem is simple. We just need to stop dumping carbon into the atmosphere. Now, from a policy standpoint, it's a little bit more difficult because nobody dumps carbon in the atmosphere for the sake of dumping carbon in the atmosphere. We do it it's a byproduct of energy, and we need power. I mean, we need power to survive. Nobody wants to live in a world without power. So the real challenge is, how do we generate all of the power we need without dumping carbon into the atmosphere? And luckily, the good news is we know how to do it. And in fact, the cheapest energy sources today are carbon-free. Wind and solar are now the cheapest energy. So we can solve the problem from a physics standpoint. And from an energy standpoint, it's really a political problem, because the people who make a lot of money burning carbon and dumping carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, they do not want to stop doing it. And they really don't care what the consequences are, because their bank account is flush with cash. And those people have enormous power in our political system. And so regardless of the consequences, they want to keep burning it. So really, that's the issue. The issue is, how do we politically transition to a world where we're not burning fossil fuels?
Aren't the green energy sources more expensive for the consumer?
Actually, they're much cheaper for the consumer. If you look at just the cost at the plug, wind and solar are now the cheapest energy sources. If you look at the Texas grid and you look at what people say they're going to be hooking up to the grid, nobody's hooking up natural gas, nobody's hooking up coal, nobody's hooking up nuclear, everyone's hooking up wind and solar, because those are the cheap energy sources. And that doesn't even include all of the enormous costs of fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are incredibly expensive. Let me explain this, because this is something that everybody has to understand. When you buy a gallon of gas, when you buy a kilowatt hour of electricity, you are not paying the full cost. Okay, you're not paying for the millions of people who are killed every year from air pollution from fossil fuels. That's a big drag on our economy. You're not paying for the climate change impacts. Hurricane Harvey, all the hurricanes that hit, sea level rise, extreme heat events in the Pacific Northwest, forest fires in California, all of those things are made worse by climate change. You don't pay for that when you buy a gallon of gas. In addition, there are these vicious price swings with fossil fuels. In fact, Europe right now is going through a period of extremely high costs of natural gas. These vicious price swings are economically destabilizing. In fact, if you look at the US economy over the last few decades, the price swings have often caused recessions. Those don't exist with wind and solar. So, and finally, we have enormous subsidies for fossil fuels. One subsidy, for example, is all the money we spend on national defense. I mean, we have engaged in 2 wars over the last 20 years in the US in order to protect the price of oil, basically. We invaded Iraq twice, and that cost trillions of dollars. And if you incorporate all of the costs, fossil fuels are incredibly expensive. I mean, there is no reason for us to continue a fossil fuel economy except for the power that fossil fuel producers have in our political system. If they didn't have this power, we would be switching to renewables at a very rapid rate because they are the cheapest energy. They're the best for the economy. They're the best for most people, not for the very small people that own fossil fuel infrastructure, but for everybody else. Renewable energy is the cheapest, is the best. It will fill your wallet with money compared to fossil fuels.
Okay, how do you feel about nuclear power? I think I've had other people on the podcast talk about climate a couple of times, I think, and I've heard positive things about nuclear power. So
yeah, I mean, so my feeling about all of the various energy sources is that they should fight it out on a level playing field. Fossil fuels should be fully priced. All of the things in there, they should be priced. If you did that, fossil fuels would disappear because they're so expensive. I feel nuclear is the same way. Nuclear right now is probably the only energy source that's gotten more expensive over the last 10 years. Everything else has gotten cheaper, but nuclear has gotten more expensive. Now, it's possible that someone will come up with a design that's very cheap, in which case I would be okay with that. But as of right now, nuclear is just not competitive. Until it is competitive with wind and solar, which are very cheap and getting cheaper, I don't see any reason to build it. There's no fundamental reason to build nuclear over any other source of power until it gets cheaper.
okay, and then with wind turbines. So I think it was last year when Texas froze, didn't some of the wind turbines freeze?
So during the Texas blackout in February, so many energy sources underproduced. So there were some wind turbines that did seem to not produce. And that was because, they weren't designed to work in those temperatures. You can build wind turbines that work in very cold temperatures, but those wind turbines simply weren't designed with the equipment needed to operate in low temperatures. The important thing to understand about the blackout, though, is that it was mainly a failure of fossil fuel infrastructure. It was not a failure of wind turbines. It was almost 100% due to natural gas.
Okay, and how did that? I'm not very familiar with what happened, to tell you the truth. So how did natural gas fail then? They just run out?
Yeah, it's a long story, but basically the problem with the natural gas infrastructure in Texas is that it's not designed to run at very cold temperatures. So a lot of the gas that comes out of the ground in Texas has water in it. And at very cold temperatures, gas comes out with water, the water freezes, and it then plugs up the well. So you don't get any gas coming out. And in addition, a lot of the natural gas infrastructure is driven by electricity. So then when the natural gas went out, that caused a lot of power to be lost. Once the power was lost, the natural gas that was still producing stopped being produced because the compressors and valves and all that stuff runs on electricity. The electricity went down. A lot of them were not designated as critical infrastructure that the electricity companies would keep the power flowing to under any circumstances. So they got cut off. So it was a real disaster. This is an issue with how the free market energy system in Texas is designed. There's no incentive for energy manufacturers to spend money to weatherize their natural gas infrastructure because when the power goes out, they don't pay for it. It's society that pays $150, $200 billion. It's not the natural gas producers. They lose a little bit of revenue. It's not a big deal for them. Why would they spend a lot of money winterizing and making sure their infrastructure is robust? It's a good business decision for them, but it's terrible for society.
Okay, that makes sense. So you talked a little bit about how to solve the problem, which is to release less CO2. What happens, and you're saying that renewable energy could be cheaper, but at the moment I know that you can get heat shortages for people who can't afford heat properly. This is another argument that's commonly brought up, that if you crank up the price of natural gas, then you start pricing people out of the market, and then that affects older people or people who don't have as much money, and you end up with people who don't have enough heat in the wintertime. So how do you start addressing, is raising the price of natural gas an appropriate response to trying to reduce the amount of natural gas that's, I guess, used?
Right. So one of the policy responses is indeed something like a carbon tax, which would raise the price of energy in proportion to how much carbon dioxide it emits. So it wouldn't raise the price of solar and wind, wouldn't raise the price of nuclear, wouldn't raise the price of hydro, but it would raise the price of gas a bit. It would raise the price of coal power a lot. Now, one of the arguments you always do here is, oh, this is going to bankrupt middle-class families and it's going to throw people out of work. So there are a couple of responses to that. Number one, people are incredibly clever. And once there's a price on something, the solution to that, ways to get around that, will be very rapidly innovated. So people often talk about innovation as the key to this. And so how do you get innovation? Well, you put a price on something. Once there's a price on carbon, there will be a lot of innovation. Now, there nevertheless might be a short period, when you're waiting for innovation to occur and for new energy sources to be deployed, where prices do go up. But you have to realize, if it's a carbon tax, the increase in price is all going to the government in the form of money. Now, they've got to do something with that. And so they can use that, for example, to give money back to low-income people, so to help them pay their bills. You don't want a regressive tax. And so people spend a lot of time thinking about what's the right way to recycle the money you get from a carbon tax. You could use it to reduce the debt. You could use it to reduce taxes on other things. You could use it to supplement R&D. You could use it to reimburse people of low income, to help them pay for the tax. Because you're right, you don't want people to go without power.
So potentially, when a carbon tax bill is introduced, it would maybe be smarter if they said, okay, we're going to tax people, but the money that we're getting from that is going to go towards offsetting some of the problems that creating a tax would cause. That might be a better way to go about doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, there's a lot of groups out there that advocate exactly that. There's this group, Citizens Climate Lobby, where they advocate for something called a cap and dividend, I think is what they call it, where all of the money raised just gets cut in a check and distributed back to all the taxpayers. So, the problem here is, and this is the key thing you've got to realize, is that the objections to it are not because it's going to hurt low and middle class people. The people who object to this, it's not because we can't do it. It's because these people are trying to protect the fossil fuel industry. So coming up with better policies doesn't solve the fundamental objection these people have. They'll never say it, but this is their fundamental objection. They will do everything to keep us burning fossil fuels, because that's how people who produce fossil fuels make money. And they don't want to not make money. There's the very small number of people who are tremendously benefiting from our current system. So all of these objections people bring up, it's going to be bad for poor people. And you say, well, here's a policy workaround. It never moves them, because that's not actually their objection. They don't care about the poor people. They care about fossil fuel producers. And so, you've got to understand that's the objection. It is not all of these other problems are solvable. The thing you can't solve is fossil fuel producers. They are going to get hurt. Okay. The workers, they can be retrained. There'll be new jobs for them in the clean energy industry, but there's a small number of people. If you own a coal mine, what are you going to do? If you own a oil well services company, actually oil well services companies could find jobs in renewable energy. But there are a lot of business. There are some businesses where the very rich owners are not going to be able to recover from this. And those are the people who object.
What percentage of CO2 emissions are actually from Americans? Like, is it not other countries that are contributing more to this problem? Yeah.
So, I'm not sure I know the exact number, but it's about a sixth of emissions come from the U.S. Maybe it's probably less than that now. Don't quote me on the exact number, but the U.S. is the second largest emitter behind China. So China is the largest emitter. China has 4 times as many people, though. So per capita, their emissions are lower than the U.S. emissions. So the next question you're going to ask is, why should the U.S. do anything if other countries aren't? And, the U.S. is a superpower. We're a world leader. And other countries will follow along with our lead. And I know people are skeptical that China's going to do anything, but China has already agreed to peak their emissions in 2030 and to get emissions to zero in 2060. I would just add that China is now also a world leader in producing renewable energy technology. The US could have 20 years ago been the leader in producing solar panels, producing wind turbines, et cetera. But, we essentially we just ignored that opportunity. And now China is the world leader. So they are really going to be behind renewable energy. And they also have big air pollution problems, which they can solve by stopping burning coal. So the rest of the world will go along with it once the US and Europe and all the other big countries commit to it. Everyone else will have to go along with it. So I think that in many ways, it is the US that's keeping world progress from happening. And once the US commits and people believe it, then I think you'll see a lot of progress. I mean, I can't overstate kind of the damage that Trump did to the US credibility on the issue. And I do think a lot of other countries think, well, Biden's saying the right things now, but who knows who's going to be elected in 2024? And maybe they're just going to reverse the US position again. And so people don't look at us as reliable partners on this problem. And that really hurts the politics.
Is there an issue with storing renewable energy?
Okay, so when you talk about how would you actually build a grid that is running on renewable energy, there are obviously some challenges. And one of them is the intermittency of solar and wind. And so clearly, any renewable energy grid will mainly be solar and wind, but you can't rely 100% on solar and wind because of the intermittency problems. Now, there are several ways to get around the intermittency. So one way is to build lots of transmission lines, because while the sun may not be shining where you are or the wind blowing, it's shining, the sun is shining, the wind is blowing somewhere, probably not too far away from you. And you can just transport the energy by power grids, by the power grid. You can wheel energy around, as they say. So that's one way to do it. Another way to do it is to store the energy. So you build batteries, for example, and the price of batteries is coming down. I think there needs to be some technological development, innovation in the battery space. And the way to do that, by the way, is to put a price on carbon. If you have a carbon tax, that will tell people we need to spend more money doing R&D on batteries, because if we make a cheaper battery, we are going to get rich. So I do think there needs to be more R&D in batteries, but batteries clearly, even now, there are batteries being built. So people view them as profitable business areas. There's also, you do need some firm dispatchable energy. So something that you can just flip the switch and turn on all the time. You need probably 10 or 20% of your energy needs to be firm and dispatchable. And that could be nuclear, it could be hydroelectric, it could be geothermal. Maybe even for 10% of your power, you keep you keep natural gas with carbon capture. There are lots of options for that last 10 or 20% that's really hard to solve with wind and solar because of their intermittency. And lastly, there's what we call demand response. So you get people to agree that if in times when the energy is short, maybe you don't run your dishwasher, you don't run your washing machine, and you don't ask people to do this. You have smart appliances which can detect the energy level and maybe delay starting until the middle of the night. You could also do demand response with industrial consumers. And essentially all they do is your time shifting the demand. Instead of using energy right now when there's maybe a shortfall of energy because you're not generating as much solar as you thought, you shift it to a time when there's more energy available. And so the combination of all of these things would allow us to build a renewable grid that essentially satisfies our energy 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. When you flip a switch, there's power there. And that's really what people care about. People really don't care about anything else. They just want power when they want it at a price that's reasonable. And we can do that.
Yeah, that sounds like a lot of infrastructure to set up. But you think that starts with a carbon tax, starts with some money from somewhere, right? And a need for it. Or running out of some other type of energy, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, so I think the mistake you're making here is that you're positing a world where we don't spend money versus a world where we do spend money. In all cases, we're going to be spending money. The question is, what kind of world do you want to live in? Do you want to live in a world where we're spending all of our money building seawalls to protect cities, rebuilding cities after they get destroyed by turbocharged hurricanes, rebuilding houses that burn in forest fires in California, building flood infrastructure? So we could live in that world, a world where we're spending all of our income trying to stay alive. Or we can live in a world where we spend the money building transmission lines and solar energy and wind turbines, and then we don't live in that world. And that second world is a world where we don't have savage price swings from oil and gas prices. We don't have air pollution killing tens of thousands of Americans every year, millions of people worldwide. We're not invading Iraq. That's, in my opinion, speaking as a citizen here, that's a better world. And I'd much rather spend money rebuilding our energy infrastructure than spending money rebuilding cities after they get hammered by climate change.
It's fair. What's the time frame for some of these disasters, or is that something we're seeing already? I mean, you talked about the war, but I mean for things like sea levels rising and having to build walls or really dangerous hurricanes, is that happening now, or is that something
absolutely.
That's happening in 10 years? No.
Climate change is here, and as I tell my students, I expect a lot of my students to live to 2100. They're going to live through it, and they're going to be affected by the decisions that we make in the next decade or two. And, we're seeing heat waves, we're seeing extreme floods, we're seeing more damage from hurricanes, we're seeing everything. And the thing that's important to understand is this is a small preview of what's coming. We've had 1 degree Celsius, about 2 degrees Fahrenheit of warming, and we're already seeing the impacts. Now imagine a world with 3 degrees Celsius, about 6 degrees Fahrenheit of warming. It's going to be far worse than 3 times as bad because the impacts are nonlinear, which means every degree gives you a lot more damage than the previous degree. So, this is a small preview of what's coming, and it's going to be much, much worse. And, we control to a large extent what kind of world we want to live in, but we have to make the decisions relatively soon. And, it's not always looking good.
Yeah, I think some of the skepticism. Okay, so say me growing up, I remember hearing, we're running out of gas in the 90s, I think. And then I can remember my dad being like, yeah, well, they said that in the 70s and then it didn't happen then, just skeptical. And then I don't have any understanding of, say, there's a hurricane here. I haven't been hit by a hurricane, so I haven't seen that damage. But are those actually significantly worse than they were 100 years ago?
Well, I mean, it depends. So it depends on exactly what you're talking about. So let me give you a few examples. So the Pacific Northwest heat wave that just occurred, those temperatures were off the chart terrible. I mean, in Canada, there was Lytton that got to 50 Celsius, maybe not quite 50, but almost 50 Celsius, over 120 Fahrenheit. And then the next day it burned down. Just the heat waves are off the chart. I mean, they're worse than predicted by climate models. If you look at intense rainfall events, so we can see rainfalls getting more intense, exactly along the lines of what was predicted by models. Now, when you talk about hurricanes are a bit tricky because they're infrequent but catastrophic events. So getting statistics on things like a number of occurrences is really kind of hard. And so we don't really have a good feeling for the numbers of storms. But we do have a sense that storms are going to be rainier and they're going to be more intense. Again, we don't necessarily have data that show that because they're just not well measured in the historical record. But we have good, strong physical theories, and physics works. So if the physics tells you something's going to happen, it's probably going to happen.
The heat wave, I had friends in Alberta when the heat wave hit, and it was like people died. That was intense. That was strange. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. No, I mean, people die, and it's a tragedy. The thing to look at and the thing to realize, and again, this is 1 degree Celsius of warming, is that we are not prepared for the kinds of changes that are coming. Our world is designed to live in a certain temperature range. because of all the infrastructure that we build is designed for temperature range. And as the temperature departs that range, the world that we've designed is no longer appropriate for it. So people don't have air conditioning in these places that are going to get really hot. And so your choice is, installing air conditioning is thousands of dollars, or you suffer. And, if you're poor and your health is bad, then you die. And so it's going to be very tough. And, I understand you personally may not have been affected by it, but I guarantee one of these days you're going to wake up and you're going to say, wow, this is terrible. And it's not going to be, people are affected by thresholds in the climate system. It's not the case that things get a little bit worse every year and over many years they get really bad. What it is there's no effect. And all of a sudden things get really bad very quickly. And so you probably sit there and you think, well, I'm fine. And you very well might have been fine up till now. But, next year or the year after that, or in 10 years, I don't know exactly when, you're going to wake up and something really bad will have happened. You'll think, wow, this has really affected me and I never saw it coming. But I'm telling you, it's coming.
So say we switched over to renewable energy sources now, how much of this is reversible?
Well, very little of it is reversible in the sense that carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere essentially forever on human times, on the timescales that we care about. It's effectively forever. It's really, hundreds or thousands of years. And so once we've emitted carbon in the atmosphere, it stays around. But that means that we can stop future warming. We really can't reverse the past warming. And so that's important to understand. We are where we are, and we're not going to get back to pre-industrial for a very long time. But we have a lot of control over what's coming. And if you look at the predictions, the difference between a low emission scenario, a world where we take climate change seriously, and a world where we don't take climate change seriously is several degrees Celsius in 2100. So, you very well might live to 2100. And, those two worlds are going to be very different. And one of them is going to be a much better world than the other one. That's the low warming world. And I guarantee you do not want to be in the high warming world. I mean, even though you personally might be okay, it's not going to be a good world to live in. And we control that. We just have to make the right decisions.
Okay. So me joking about just warming Canada up a little bit and then pausing climate change there, that's not actually that funny.
Yeah, no, I mean, a lot of these places where people say, oh, I could use a little climate change here, they're engineered, they're designed for the temperatures they experience. And if you move the climate of San Diego to Canada, it would be a disaster. I mean, all the ecosystems wouldn't be able to handle it. The way people design the world, everything you build, every building, every train track, every bridge is built with a range of climate in mind. And when the climate changes, all of those assumptions that go into the designs are no longer appropriate.
Yeah. And I guess we saw that in Texas last year.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, that's why I tell people about the blackout. To be clear, I don't think the weather was caused by climate change. Sometimes it just gets cold in Texas. And I think that was the case. But what it shows you is, Texas is fine at 28 degrees. But when you get, 18 degrees and then 10 degrees, the whole system collapses. I mean, so you don't have to get very far outside the range of the temperatures that you are designed for before everything falls apart. And it's not the case that it falls apart smoothly. Again, as I said before, as the temperature goes down, you're fine. And then at some point, your pipes freeze. At that point, things get really bad very quickly. It's thresholds. I mean, that's the most important thing that people have to realize are thresholds in the climate system. When you pass them, things go to hell very, very quickly. And it's very hard to tell when you're right on the cusp of a threshold. But a lot of people are on the cusp of thresholds. There are a lot of people out there thinking, oh, I'm fine, but you're not fine. You're about to pass a threshold and you are definitely not going to be fine from that. And, it's going to be a bad ride if we don't do anything about it. In fact, I mean, it'll be bad for some people, even if we take action, because we've let things go so far, but we can still head off the worst of the impacts and make an overall better world in many other ways if we take action.
Are there other countries that we could be following more for? Like, are there other countries that are ahead of, say, the States in climate change or a response to it?
Sure, there are. There are lots of countries. The European Union has taken climate change far more seriously than the U.S. And it's always problematic to compare countries because countries have different issues. The U.S., we have big cities where everybody owns a car, whereas in Europe the cities are smaller. They have better public transportation. But overall, the U.S. is definitely has been a laggard, although states and cities have been trying to do well. So if you look in the U.S., the federal government has basically done nothing on climate change, but states and cities have been working. And so they've done a lot of, I think, positive things. But ultimately, we need the federal government to come in and really, we need an overarching national policy on this. This is a place where the free market's not going to work. It's just not, the free market will not work on this. And so we need the government to do that. And there are other countries that are far ahead of us on this.
Okay, actually, well, one question, this might be a silly question, but haven't there been periods of warming and cooling throughout history? And can we be absolutely positive that this is a period of warming? It's not just change, right? It's specifically warming.
Yeah. So the answer, So the answer to your first half of the question is absolutely. The climate has changed over the Earth's entire history. So it is completely reasonable to say maybe the warming of the 20th century and the early 21st century, maybe that's also natural. So that's a completely reasonable initial question. Now, the thing to realize is that scientists are not idiots. So we've asked ourselves that question also, and we can look at all of the things that have caused the climate to change over the geologic record, things like the orbit of the Earth, the movement of the continents. We can look at we have a list, we can look at all the suspects, and the answer is none of them can explain the warming. But carbon dioxide from fossil fuel combustion explains it perfectly. 100%. Everything is explained by that. And so that's why, if you were on a jury and, the prosecution said, look, there are no other suspects. We can eliminate every other suspect. And this suspect, carbon dioxide, he dropped his wallet at the crime scene. We found his fingerprints there. He was videotaped carrying stuff out of the building when he robbed it. When he was arrested, all the stolen merchandise was in his trunk. He was bragging to his friends he did it. I mean, the evidence supporting carbon dioxide is just overwhelming. It's like, if you were on a jury and there wasn't all of the political aspects and tribalism surrounding climate change, you'd say, of course, carbon dioxide did it. I mean, of course, there's really no dispute. And yes, we've looked at all the other suspects and no, none of them could have done it.
Okay. Wow. I think that wraps up for all the questions I had. If people want to find you online or find out more about this, do you have any place to direct people to?
Well, if you're looking for information on climate change, you have a question, is it the sun? Is it, how do we know carbon dioxide increases are due to humans? I would go to skepticalscience.com. That's my go-to resource when people ask me questions. They say, where can I do this? It's really well designed, well vetted. If you want to go one layer deeper, you can always look at the reports, scientific assessments from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the National Academy of Sciences. Those have all of the reference peer-reviewed literature. The problem, of course, is that there's a lot of misinformation online. And so if you're really trying to learn about climate change, the real challenge is figuring out the correct information from the incorrect information, because there's a lot of incorrect information, much like COVID or anything else. There's a lot of misinformation out there. And so really that's the challenge. And you want to stick to authoritative sources, not some dude with a blog or a lot of Twitter followers, but people who rely on the peer-reviewed literature, because that's how science works. We rely on the peer-reviewed literature, and that's the most, the best representation of what the science says, and the scientific assessments reflect that.
Do you know, okay, I have one last question. Do you know anything about hydrogen fuel cells for storing renewable energy?
So the short answer is no. I don't know a lot about hydrogen. That said, I'm open to hydrogen. I think hydrogen needs to battle it out with nuclear and solar and wind and geothermal. And if it turns out to be cheaper than batteries for storing energy, then yeah, I'd love to see it. But ultimately, at least so far, hydrogen doesn't look like it's going to be necessarily a cheap source. I mean, hydrogen is really hard to store. And as anyone who's seen the Hindenburg knows that there's some downsides to hydrogen. Although that's actually probably not fair. I mean, batteries can burn also. So, but hydrogen is really hard to store. It's a very small molecule. It leaks a lot. Also, you have to produce hydrogen, and you have to make sure you're producing in a way that doesn't produce carbon dioxide. So you've got to make sure that you have a good, clean source of hydrogen. You have to be able to store it. You have to be able to transport it. It's going to take a lot of infrastructure, and it's got to. If it competes on a cost basis, then right on.
Which renewable source energy do you think is going to end up being the most popular?
Well, it's going to be wind and solar. So wind and solar are already the cheapest sources of energy. The technology is, a century or several centuries old. We know how they work. They've already demonstrated the ability to produce a lot of energy. So that they're going to be the linchpin of a renewable energy system. But you need all of these other things to handle the intermittency. You need some storage, you need some transmission, you need 10 or 20% of firm dispatchable renewable energy, you need some demand response, you need other things also, but the most important energy will be wind and solar.
And this is also might be a silly question, but are there committees that are trying to build the entire infrastructure rather than just focusing on, hey, we want more wind turbines or more solar energy? Is there somebody and I know that's supposed to be the government's job, but are there other committees that are kind of overseeing this, saying, hey, this is how we would store it. We need 20, like what you're saying, we need 20% of something that's a little bit faster to get. Like, do they have these big plans somewhere out there?
So there are plans that think tanks and universities have put together on how do we get to zero emissions. I mean, there's no single government entity that's tasked with our entire energy system. So there are regulatory bodies that oversee the grid, and there are regulatory bodies that oversee fossil fuel production and oversee nuclear energy, but they're really not integrated. I mean, I think that's something that the government needs to do, but that doesn't really exist right now.
Okay. I think that was all my questions then. Dr. Destler, thank you very much for coming on. Is there anything else you want to talk about?
The only thing I would say, and this may not come up or may come up, is that I think we should be very grateful to fossil fuels for getting us where we are. We live a great life because of fossil fuels, and I'm eternally grateful to them. And so the question is not, were fossil fuels good? Of course they were. The question is, what future do we want to live in? Do we want to live in a world where we continue burning fossil fuels, or a world where we kind of say, let's take the training wheels off and, go with a better energy source? As I alluded to, training wheels, you put on your bike at first, but at some point you take them off because you grow past it. I think we've grown past fossil fuels.
I like that ending. Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming on. That was good.
That was a great discussion. I appreciate it.